Welcome to the Breach Show featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Cole. The federal New Democratic Party, the NDP, is looking to rebuild after losing its leader, Jagmeet Singh, and more than half of its seats in parliament in the last federal election. Part of that rebuilding process is going to involve choosing a new leader of the party. But how will that be done? Who makes the rules? And who's likely to run and succeed? To discuss that, I'm joined by Martin Lukacs, the managing editor of The Breach and the author of the recently released book, The Polyev Project, A Radical Blueprint for Corporate Rule. Hey, Martin, how's it going?
Hey, Desmond.
So you've just released for us a piece entitled NDP Insiders Are Trying to Fix the Leadership Race for an Establishment Candidate. A bit of a kind of warning about what could possibly happen with this upcoming leadership for the federal NDP. So the first question I want to ask you is, in the wake of this defeat of the last federal election, who's running the show for the New Democratic Party, for the NDP? Because they've lost a bunch of seats, they've lost a bunch of staff, they've lost their leader. So who kind of remains to hold everything together in a situation like this?
Not very many people. I think there's been a layoff of about 100 to 150 staff. And the thing is, there weren't very many people who ran the show in the first place. Like, there's a very funny metaphor about Canada being 3 mining companies in a trench coat.
Mm-hmm.
The NDP has, practically speaking, been 3 or 4 consultants in an orange trench coat. And with a lot of this consultant class now being laid off, there's really only one left. So the trench coat has gotten a lot roomier. Lucy Watson is the federal director of the party, and she's basically calling the shots, especially when it comes to this leadership race. There is an interim leader, Don Davies, but really the buck often stops with the political staffer class, and there's not many of them left.
Now, in addition to political staffers, you talk a lot in this piece about the grip that consultants have on the party. And you've written before about a number of former party insiders who have become consultants and lobbyists who are really able to influence like the leadership of the party, the direction of policy. So given this election defeat, how do you feel that those people are going to influence what happens now?
Well, maybe it's worth giving like a little potted history of how it is that consultants came to have such a influence and power within the party.
That's a good idea.
I do think it dates back about 3 decades to when the NDP started to make an accommodation in the 1990s with the ascendant neoliberalism of the age. And both at the provincial and then eventually federal level, they sawed off a lot of the more ambitious social democratic policies they had. So out the window went, public ownership, major wealth redistribution, and really big visionary projects to remake the country and remake society. And as I think the ideological differences between the NDP and, say, the Liberal Party diminished, there was a real turn towards emphasis on political branding, selling the unique personality of the leader, emphasizing focus groups and polling and kind of air war tactics. And that naturally, I think, led to an injection of profit-making political marketing techniques and an entire orientation. And you saw, starting in the late 90s and then accelerating through the 2000s and 2010s, an entire generation of senior staffers in the NDP who started taking jobs in corporate lobbying firms. So they became a lot more corporate friendly, a lot more moderate, and and a lot more aligned with the party operatives in the other political parties, whether that be liberal or conservative. And I think that what we see now is a class of consultants who often cycle between provincial and federal campaigns and going back to work in these federal corporate lobby firms. And I think it's really insinuated a very different political outlook, far more removed from working class concerns, far more hostile and skeptical of the messiness of social movements. And I think it's really damaged the, previous ambition and political, vision of the NDP. And I think one other aspect is the party, with the rise and consolidation of the control of this consulting class, you saw a complete hollowing out of any kind of working class background. Like, the party now is generally run by people for whom politics is a vocation, not like an urgent political purpose. And I think that's been deeply damaging. And I think also is one of the root causes of the failures over the last 15 years, and especially in this past election.
Okay, it's probably worth naming the owners of these few hands, yes? Who are we exactly talking about here? Who are some examples of people that you suggest are really having this level of influence in the party and moving in between campaigns and, lobbying organizations?
So people like Brian Topp, Anne McGrath, Brad Levine, Lucy Watson now at the federal party. I mean, I don't love to get personal because I do think these people are just proxies for structural forces. But if someone like an Anne McGrath, who once upon a time was actually a Communist Party member back in her early days, is someone who, for instance, worked in the federal party and then went to go work for a lobbying firm, and then went back and worked for the Alberta NDP when it came into government, and then when the government fell, went back to a lobbying firm, and then most recently was the national party director for the NDP up until about a year or so ago. So I think the NDP was undergoing this political shift, moderating, centralizing control among a small group of operatives, really disconnecting from working class communities and social movements. And then as these people consolidated these firms, that then reinforced this trend. So it was a kind of like a self-fulfilling and deepening cycle. And I think the people who have gone and made careers in this world and tried to push the NDP rightward are well aware of this dynamic. In that article that I wrote a few years ago about how the NDP has basically been taken over by lobbyists, I quote Robin Sears, who was one of the first people to undergo this this move to lobbying firms, saying this will actually discipline and mature people within the NDP. They won't just be spraying their fire, indiscriminately. They're going to realize that, it might be one of their friends they're critiquing if they try to raise these concerns. And so it has effectively acted as a muzzle to discuss the underlying, I think, malaise that this has created. So I really think the Band-Aid needs to be ripped off, and people need to reckon with it seriously. Because if we don't, this kind of high-level operative class will continue having a malign influence on the party's future.
Well, in the near to medium term future of the party, there's going to be a leadership race and a chance to begin kind of renewing the party after this last election. The Globe and Mail had a piece a couple of days ago entitled "New Democrats Say They Want Leadership Race Rules to Ensure Multiple Serious Candidates, Shorter Contest." So this is from Emily Hawes in the Globe and Mail, and it outlines a bunch of, I would say, party insiders suggesting what this new process for choosing a new leader should be, how much money it should cost to register, how long the period of the campaign would be, whether or not it would be kind of one member and one vote, or whether there would be some other way of choosing the leader in terms of voting. So we're getting a look at that, Martin. Why do you think that people inside of the party want things like a shorter election period or regional votes instead of one member, one vote? Why do you think people are pushing for these particular kinds of rules for the leadership race?
First off, it was really funny that the Globe and Mail publishes this headline that New Democrats say, and then it turns out it's not actually a diverse look at New Democrats. It's literally four of the very insiders that we've been talking about.
It's
and
speaking to the exact critique that you made in your
exactly.
piece.
And to me, this was very clearly a trial balloon put out by the party establishment, the consultant class, an attempt to gauge public reaction, and I think also to soften up the membership for the push that's going to come to get these preferred rules that I think will advantage an establishment candidate that will maintain the status quo and really damage the prospects of any kind of insurgent challenger who wants to take the NDP in a different direction. And to some degree, I'm actually grateful that they kind of tipped their hand in their effort to put this trial balloon out, because now we know what is coming down the pipes. So there's probably two of the preferences that they have that I think are worth focusing on. And the first is a short race. And I think a short race, if it's, 3 to 6 months, will only advantage someone who has the support already of the party. It's not very much time to build momentum, to sign up new members, and it's certainly not enough time to have the kind of cross-country reckoning and dissection of the existing failures of the party that I think a lot of members, rank-and-file members of the party, are really hungry to do. The NDP is in a really rough state. A lot of riding associations are, really atrophied. Droves of activists have left the party after one or another disappointment. Social movements, I think, feel estranged and ignored or dismissed by the party. And I think Canadians broadly don't really have a clear sense of what the party's vision is. And so I think a longer leadership race could do those things. It could, you could imagine like town halls in rural and urban areas. You could imagine thematic discussions, say, on Palestine or housing, really competitive debates that air big ideas about how to take on Trump's attacks on the country or the extreme corporate control of our economic system. And I think all of those would be curtailed by a short leadership race that would see candidates who can draw on the existing, membership of the party win. So I think it's clear that the establishment wants it to be short. The other thing to remember is party members can only vote in a leadership convention if they've been members for 45 days or 90 days even, which is what we saw in the BC NDP leadership race a few years ago. So if a race is being held, if a leadership convention is being held in like November or December, that basically means you have to be a member by the end of the summer. And even if you're a super active activist, you probably want to take a bit of time off in the summer. Summer times are really not when, we see peak activity in organizing. And so I think they realize that a short race will forestall the emergence of any kind of candidate who can really generate enthusiasm. And then the other tip off to me that they are trying to cook the race is they are trying to introduce a new system of voting in the leadership convention. So previously, the NDP since 2006 has operated on a one person, one vote basis. to me, that makes a lot of sense. It's democratic. If you sign up tens of thousands of members and an opponent signs up a quarter of that, it makes sense that you're going to win. What they're trying to push for, from what we can tell from this trial balloon of an article, is a regionally weighted vote system, which would basically mean that each riding association, of which there are 343, would be given 100 points. And then regardless of how many members a riding association might have, let's say it's 5, let's say it's 5,000, they would still be granted the same amount of total votes. So it basically means that rather than a campaign that is about generating national enthusiasm, really, reviving the prospects of the party, getting people excited about it, and signing up a shit ton of people, it's going to be much more about a micro-targeted race to see who can, technically focus on each of the ridings and, marginally improve the numbers in each of them so that they can, come out better in total. And I also think that this would advantage any candidate who has the backing of the party consultant class and the party center, because they have access, the party center has access to all kinds of proprietary resources that would be very useful for such a candidate. They have access to lapsed membership lists, they have access to previous leadership campaign lists, and we have to be honest that party establishments, whether in the NDP or elsewhere, do engage in a lot of dirty tricks. We've seen them before, even in recent leadership races. And I do think it would be likely that they would be feeding that to a preferred leadership candidate.
I can understand how this might sound a little bit conspiratorial to some people in our audience, that there is to like cite Clone High, there's a board of shadowy figures lurking in the background, just waiting for this opportunity to manipulate the campaign. Are you maybe making too many assumptions here about this class of people and their intent on, cooking the outcome?
Yeah. I mean, one man's institutional analysis is another man's conspiracy theory. I do find that is something that just gets flung at you when you are analyzing the historical patterns of an organization. I was actually looking at Reddit yesterday just to see the reaction to the piece that I wrote, and I definitely saw a few people saying, this is such a nefarious conspiracy plot that Lukacs is imagining.
Sure.
And then someone else replied, oh, but what about what the party establishment did to Angelia Padarai, who tried to run for BC NDP leader in 2022, and look at all the dirty tricks they engaged. And then a third person jumped in saying, oh no, we definitely did sabotage her campaign, and it's a good thing we did.
Love when people say the quiet part out loud, yeah?
Exactly. And that's a campaign that we reported on extensively. And it was interesting that it was a very similar group of consultants, many of whom in BC in particular, have ended up in lobbying firms that are lobbying on behalf of fossil fuel interests. We're especially worried and threatened by an activist like Anjali, who comes out of the climate movement, is an eco-socialist, and they engaged in very well-documented tactics to undermine her from defeating David Eby. And we were in a situation there, similarly, where Anjali had signed up more than 10,000 members in her leadership campaign. And David Eby had organized a fraction of that. And there was a process where the party establishment changed the rules midway. They were the only ones who had access to the membership rolls, and so they engaged in a very aggressive vetting campaign, calling up all these new members, trying to find ways of disqualifying them. One of the tactics they used is that they claimed that anyone who had donated to a different party previously was not a legit member of the NDP. So people who had given a bit of money to the Green Party in the province, which arguably was as progressive, if not more, on certainly some issues than the NDP, could not be NDP members. And finally, the final act of the kind of sabotage was that an inquiry was launched by the party establishment, run by, big surprise, yet another one of these people who had been part of a lobbying firm that had lobbied for gas interests in the province, and they basically found a way to disqualify her. So the notion that this is some kind of nefarious conspiracy simply doesn't track with the evidence that we have from even the past few years. And I would also add that this is not something unique to the NDP. I think that this is a natural pattern that you see in any kind of bureaucratized organization. So Robert Michels, who's a great French sociologist, has this, and was writing about political parties 100 years ago, had this very useful rule of politics. He called it the iron law of organizations. And what it was basically that his view, and I think it's correct to this day, that in an organization that has grown a bureaucratic layer, those bureaucrats will be more invested in maintaining the power that they have within the organization than they have in building the power of the organization itself externally. And I think that's the situation we've gotten to with the NDP, where politically, the class of consultants who have run the party now for a few decades are so deeply invested in the control of the party that I think even when, to many of us, there could be a political turn that would massively advantage the NDP, they simply can't conceive of it being a possibility that they could allow. For instance, even Anjali Appadurai, who ran federally in 2021, tried to become a candidate for the federal party in this past election, and she had come within 400 votes in Vancouver Granville from winning. This same party leadership basically delayed her vetting as a candidate for a whole year and only allowed her to be a candidate a few weeks before this past federal election, which basically made it impossible for her to run an effective campaign. So they would rather lose a riding than have a radical like Anjali become a candidate. I think that is a very clear picture of their outlook.
I mean, if I can add to this a little bit, I remember my reporting days covering Toronto City Council more than a decade ago. And I got to do really obscure things that a lot of mainstream outlets don't care to cover, like, for example, by-elections. And there was a by-election provincially in Scarborough, in the east part of Toronto, in 2013. And there were two candidates for the NDP. One was a labor organizer named Amarjeet Chabra, and the other was a local politician, like city council politician and NDP stalwart named Adam Giambrone. Some of our Toronto area members will probably remember Adam Giambrone. He was a rising star in the NDP and in, progressive political circles. He tried unsuccessfully to run for mayor in 2010. And, the party really, I think, wanted to see him in a leadership position. So when this seat came open in 2013 in Scarborough, he also put his name forward against Amarjeet Chabra. He didn't live in Scarborough, she did. And a lot of people already kind of saw him as like parachuting into the riding. But what happened was that it was an extremely close nomination meeting for who was going to get the seat for the NDP. And reportedly, Giambrone won by 4 votes. Immediately, Chabra and her team contested the results, saying that there were a whole bunch of members who had voted who were not eligible actually to vote. And the party clammed up. They would not give any information to the media. They would not deny this claim that there were several more members than could influence the outcome who had signed up, but who were not really eligible under the party rules to sign up. So as a result, you have a candidate, an establishment white man who doesn't live in the area, coming in and under very strange circumstances that the party would not clarify, taking the seat just barely from somebody local who's a labor organizer with a lot of ties in the local community. It looked very bad. I reported on it at length. The party really would not give us any information. Giambrone was subsequently blown out in the by-election that happened after winning that nomination. And the riding association president, I remember, released a statement being like, we were completely demotivated from working because of the way that this process worked. And I think, Martin, that speaks to your point about like recruiting at the national level for this upcoming race, is if people feel like the rules are skewed towards an establishment candidate and are fixed to prevent outsiders from coming in, well, why is there going to be any enthusiasm? Why are people going to sign up to the party? If it's not one member, one vote, and they do this regional thing, there's no incentive for new people to come on board and sign up because the party's not looking to get like mass, registrations to the party. So I have seen how things like this even influence the course of an election because people feel really demotivated when a nomination process doesn't seem fair.
Yeah, I think that speaks to how they don't recognize that if the NDP is to have any success, it needs to have a movement behind it, you know? And I think as disenchanting and alienating as it is, my hope is that the conclusion that people draw is not to give up on the NDP, or the possibility, I think, that that is inherent there, but has not been realized, but is instead to be fired up about how urgently we do need to reform and transform the party and ensure that, you know, these people who would prefer that there not be a democratic revival stay in control.
Let's get to, I'm sure, a burning question for many people is who would be leader? Who would benefit from the climate that you're saying is being created by party insiders? Who would be likely to throw themselves into this race? Who are the preferred establishment candidates that we know of? I know we're projecting into a future that we can't exactly guess, but
Yeah.
I mean, who do you think might be running for the federal NDP?
Well, in terms of, I can try to answer the question about who I think would be the preferred establishment candidates. I think that there, as far as I can tell, there is a bit of a scramble in the back rooms, such as they are. I think one of the probable ones could be Heather McPherson, who I think a lot of our listeners know for her progressive advocacy on Palestine.
That's right. She's an MP in Edmonton.
Yeah, Edmonton Strathcona. But I do think that she is not thoroughgoingly progressive across the board. Certainly has been a big booster of pipelines in the past. And I think the Alberta NDP convention happened just a few weeks ago, and it felt very much like the Alberta NDP was positioning her as their candidate of choice. I think she poses a bit of a conundrum for the party establishment. I think in many respects she could be that candidate for them, but I do think the party establishment is not fond of her Palestine views. And so there's a bit of a contradictory tension. I do think that in Alberta, the ideal candidate for the party establishment would be someone like Rachel Notley, who could, who's also, by federal standards, not a particularly progressive social democrat, but and I think while she was premier, spent a lot of time trying to discipline the federal party and Jagmeet Singh into towing the kind of centrist line that the Alberta government at that time would have preferred. So very pro-pipeline, not really shaking the boat. What I'm hearing is that she's not going to run, but the establishment really would like her because I think she would be a formidable candidate. And then the other one I've been hearing about is Valerie Plant, who's the Montreal mayor. And I think similarly, she is someone who's kind of, charismatically safe, built a lot of bike lanes, and has also shoveled as much money to the Montreal police as they've wanted. Is another candidate who I think would be in the mold that the party party establishment has looked for over the last 15 years. Someone whose personality is exciting, but who wouldn't necessarily want to get behind any kind of far-reaching political policies. And I don't think would be interested in trying to open up the party to a democratic renewal process that would see it really reconnect with working class communities and social movements. So I think those are the three that I've been hearing about, and I think all of them you'd see if they ran, there would be a real push to back them from the party establishment, and I imagine also the existing sitting NDP premiers, whether that's Wap Kinew or in Manitoba or David Eby in BC.
So, okay, you mentioned Valerie Plant and how, for example, she's given a lot of money to the local police force in Montreal. But that's not a Montreal thing. That's not a Valerie Plant thing. That is a Canada-wide phenomenon of, for example, police budgets increasing across the country. And I'm bringing that up because, Martin, I think that the consultant class that you're talking about in the NDP would probably argue that your analysis just doesn't account for where the country is and where the country is going. Like, look what just happened in the last federal election. The two parties to the center and center right in this country took votes away from the New Democrats, from the Greens, from the Bloc Québécois. Their argument, I'm sure, would be that there is no appetite for the kind of more left-leaning politics that maybe we talk about a lot more here at The Breach, that the kind of social movements that we want to see informing federal politics actually need to be smarter and get in line with a more center viable political strategy. So what do you say to that?
That's a good question. Thanks for playing a centrist devil's advocate.
Anytime.
Look, I mean, I think, yeah, they make a serious this world of people make a serious case that I think we have to contend with. And they have won campaigns. This class of consultants. They won in Alberta in 2015. They've won several times in BC in recent years. They won in Manitoba in just a few years ago. But to what end is what I would say. What we see when there are NDP governments of this sort in power, you see small incremental improvements, undoubtedly. But when it comes to the, just grotesque inequalities in our society, the continuing, brutalization of racialized people by the police, the endless colonial land theft of Indigenous peoples' territories, the unaffordable housing and food, and the way in which all of those governments have enabled fossil fuel corporations to keep cooking the planet, you really have to ask, to what end? And I do think our expectations have been so utterly diminished in this country over the last few decades that a lot of us, I think, just can't even imagine that a progressive party could accomplish more or even aim to accomplish more. And I think that I also just sometimes wonder how people are so sure that something else wouldn't work when it's never been tested. It's never been tried. And the truth is that there is a super majority in this country who wants progressive policies. If you read the polls closely, as I have, on issues across the board, a Green New Deal, major wealth redistribution, true justice for Indigenous peoples, defunding the police, you have majorities in support of such things. And so I think what is at issue is not that there isn't massive political appetite in this country, but that we have a crisis of political representation on the left. We have seen this leftward shift of political and this leftward shift of political attitudes, and at various times we've seen the Liberal government play as if they genuinely believe and want to advocate for those things. But even on the left, the NDP has simply not been interested in advocating for those things, for trying to build collective strength and power behind them, and for really trying to translate those public opinions into reality. And so I think that's the issue we have. Not that people aren't ready for it, but that there's no one there to actually seize on it and build on it. And I do think, the work of championing that remains on the shoulders of social movements who need to grow even more, interconnected than they have been. But I also think with a political party who is willing to have the skill to win elections, as I think, we need to have, but also that have the will to actually follow through on these ambitious policies. And most importantly, that have the openness, the commitment to be open to social movements so that if they win office, those movements will prevent them from being de-radicalized. And I think up to now, that project, that political project, has been completely abandoned by the NDP. But to my mind, the country is ripe for it to happen.
I want to end here with this idea of the role of social movements potentially influencing a revamped New Democrat Party. And I want to give an example, and then I'll throw it over to you for the last word, Martin, because I remember in 2020, in the weeks after George Floyd had been killed in the United States, and everyone was talking about policing, as often happens in Canadian politics, the murder of George Floyd brought to light the fact that, hey, there are also similar things happening in Canada that we aren't talking about. So there had been many killings, particularly by the RCMP, of people like Chantel Moore, Rodney Levi, and many Indigenous people in 2020. A 16-year-old girl in Winnipeg, Aisha Hudson, was killed by the police for allegedly stealing from a liquor store. We weren't talking about these things very much into 2020 until George Floyd was murdered. And we remember how much enthusiasm there was for change, how people were taking to the streets in Canada and the United States, how Black Lives Matter resurged as a political idea. And in that time, Jagmeet Singh, as leader of the NDP, introduced, I think, one of the best ideas that I have seen in recent years from that party, from any federal party, on an issue that I care about anyway. And it was his proposal at the House of Commons was we should kind of look into systemic racism as it relates to the RCMP, but that there should be things that come with that in investigating their use of force incidents, and also, I think, critically, in disclosing how much the RCMP pays out in settlements every year when it harms or kills members of the public. This was such a timely proposal, and it ended up not succeeding because it needed unanimous support. The NDP was an opposition lower party, and they needed unanimous support for Jagmeet Singh's motion in order to get it through. And a member of the Bloc Québécois wouldn't give his support, and very infamously or famously, Jagmeet Singh called that member a racist. And then all the conversation derailed from how do we investigate policing in the RCMP and hold the RCMP accountable. And it shifted to, can you believe, this guy called this other guy in Canada a racist? And like the media scandalized over that for weeks. So they didn't have to talk about policing anymore. And then it was dead. But I'm just saying that to say, I really feel like, when people like Miriam Kaba and Ruth Wilson Gilmore in the United States talk about like non-reformist reforms and proposing things that can take power away from the institutions that are hurting us. Knowing how much the RCMP pays in settlements, getting disclosure about the use of force incidents at the RCMP, that would have been huge. And it was actually an example for me of Jagmeet Singh actually being connected in that moment to what people in grassroots movements were saying. And that's the potential that I see for a party like the NDP, if they are more connected, is that they can amplify and make real struggles that are happening in our communities and propose real solutions that don't just pick at the edges, that aren't just marginal, but that actually completely reframe the way we think about doing politics.
That's a great example. I think that hints at the potential that a different kind of NDP could have. And I think Jagmeet, to his credit, on issues of racism that he understood in his bones, he could at times be a very powerful advocate. And imagine a party that showed up not just in exceptional circumstances, but all the time for social movements, for the crises of poison drug supply, for housing encampments, for indigenous rights, for the anti-pipeline movement, on the picket lines for workers. I think that there is such a potential for a federal party to use the platform that it has, which is unparalleled compared to what any one social movement might have. They really have an ability to give an amplification to our issues that are in many cases really popular, but aren't making an impact on the national discourse because they don't have a party that is willing to be a megaphone for them. I think we've seen in other countries when a party like under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, the Labour Party, or even Bernie Sanders when he was making a run on the Democratic leadership. I think that not only does it have an amplification force, but I think in exposing people across the country who simply aren't being reached by us in social movements or in left-wing media outlets like that are, modest like ours, it will politically educate, even energize, and actually bring more people into our movement. So I've always been most excited about the prospect of a revived NDP in what it can do for our movements. And I think that inside-outside strategy, of having an NDP that can actually be open and collaborative with social movements, and a social movements that can understand the potential usefulness of that kind of NDP would make for a very powerful combination.
Well, we're going to continue watching this federal leadership race and providing coverage to you here at The Breach. But for now, we're going to say thank you for watching and listening today. If you like what you've heard on the show, please subscribe to our podcast. And if you want to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. And you can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.